Welcome to The Explainer. Just a quick note before we dive in. Our goal here is to be fair and just walk through the arguments in our source material. Now, some of these ideas might feel a bit sharp, and if they do, please know it's not our intention to cause hurt. The internet can be a tricky place, and we're just here to explore the information. So today, we're diving into a really provocative text that looks at what it calls the Somali fraud complex. We're going to break down the author's claims about a massive fraud scheme and how it connects to culture, politics, and what they see as systemic failure.
So let's jump right in. The source we're looking at today makes this incredibly powerful claim right here. This wasn't an accident, it was a blueprint. Right off the bat, the author is telling us that a huge fraud scandal wasn't just a random crime, but, a deliberate, repeatable strategy. So let's walk through the case they build, because it connects events from Minnesota all the way to Kenya.
Okay, so the author kicks things off with this really dramatic framing. They call it a warning from the future. According to this text, what we're about to look at isn't just another story about corruption. No, it's presented as something much, much bigger.
And this really gets to the core of their premise. The author argues that this whole case is a preview, a literal warning from the future of what happens when a welfare system that's built on trust collides with a culture that, as they describe it, is operating by a completely different set of rules. And all of this happens without any real checks and balances.
This brings us right to the central argument of the source material. It's the creation of what the author calls a perfect storm. The text is basically claiming this wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was about the collision of two fundamentally different systems, two completely different mindsets.
And this slide really breaks down those two opposing forces, at least as the author describes them. So on one side, you've got Minnesota's system, which the text says was built on trust, on slogans, and, crucially, a deep-seated fear of being called racist. And on the other side, a highly organized approach that the author claims was built on pure exploitation, using sophisticated tools like accountants and shell companies, and importantly, using community silence to operate completely under the radar.
And according to the source, this quote became the key. The author argues that the fear of this one accusation was so powerful it basically paralyzed any real oversight. It allowed the alleged fraud to grow and flourish for years, and it effectively gave the perpetrators what the text calls a free pass.
But the text claims the issue goes way deeper than just a flawed welfare system. It argues that there was a pre-existing criminal infrastructure and some really powerful social dynamics that played a critical role. Let's dig into what the author actually means by that.
The author gets really specific here, naming actual groups and listing incredibly serious crimes: drug trafficking, human trafficking, retaliatory violence. The case they're making is that this wasn't just some social challenge, as they claim politicians were calling it, but a fully formed, organized criminal underworld that was perfectly positioned to exploit this situation.
Now, this is where the source makes what it calls its most taboo claim. It argues that Somali clan loyalties created this kind of invisible but incredibly powerful structure that influenced everything from business deals to politics, and, crucially, who was protected from any kind of real investigation.
And this quote right here, it gets to the very heart of that argument. The author contends that this intense social pressure, the fear of being completely ostracized by your own community, created this powerful wall of silence. And according to the text, that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to get anyone to cooperate or for any whistleblowers to come forward.
So all of this raises a pretty critical question, and it's one the author uses to pivot the entire argument. Was what happened in Minnesota just a one-off, a unique failure of a single state system, or was it something more?
Well, the source's answer to that is a hard no. It then introduces a parallel case in Kenya to argue that this is in fact a systemic issue. The author presents Kenya not as a separate story, but as a mirror reflecting the exact same dynamics.
This table here lays out the author's comparison point by point. They argue that even though the context is totally different, you've got a welfare state versus a development zone, the mechanics are just eerily similar. The author draws a line from inflated invoices and ghost children in Minnesota to vanishing funds and fake IDs in Kenya. They compare what they call virtue signaling officials in one place to a corrupt political class in the other, and the alleged result, according to the text, it's the same: massive financial loss and systemic decay.
Okay, so all of this builds to the author's conclusion. And it's not just a critique of a crime or a specific policy, it's a sweeping judgment on the entire system that, they claim, allowed it all to happen.
So, in the end, the author's verdict isn't really about the money that was lost. They argue that the core failure was a moral one. The source contends the problem wasn't just the criminals, but a system that became, in the author's own words, too cowardly and too politically correct to enforce its own laws.
And the source doesn't stop at blaming the fraudsters. It actually creates a whole list of what it calls accomplices who enabled this collapse. And the very first group on that list? The bureaucrats who allegedly just looked the other way.
The list keeps going, and it's a pretty broad indictment of mainstream institutions. The author points a finger at journalists for, as they claim, burying the story in sociological excuses, and at policymakers for just not having the courage to act.
And here it is, the final, and maybe the most sweeping accusation of all. The author's verdict concludes that the ultimate accomplice was a Western culture that has become so afraid of offending anyone, so terrified of speaking an impolite truth, that it basically allowed itself to be exploited.
And so we end with the author's final, very provocative question. It really leaves us to think about the core warning of the text, that when a system refuses to defend its own integrity, a vacuum is created, and something else will always rush in to fill it. It's a pretty stark thought to end on.